Hello and welcome to the sixth and final session in our Architecture and Philosophy series. I'm delighted to be able to welcome Patrik Schumacher from Zahadid Architects today. Patrik has been a huge supporter of ours over the years. He is a PhD supervisor at Tongji University, and Zaha Code has been contributing workshops to Digital Futures over the years. I needn't say too much about Patrik by way of introduction. Except to say that many people are not aware that he has a background in philosophy. Before he studied architecture, he studied philosophy in Germany, and indeed he also has a PhD where he looked at the question about he looked at architecture through the lens of philosophy. It's a great pleasure to have Patrik today. He's incredibly busy. One of the things I find so astonishing is how much he manages to achieve. He runs a huge office. He teaches in many different sort of schools, and he writes enormous volumes. So welcome, Patrik. It's a great pleasure, as always, to have you here. Welcome.
Great, wonderful, guys. Should I share my screen? Because I have a presentation prepared, so to talk about the topic, fascinating topic. Let me see, share screen. Yep, that should be it. Wait, I've jumped to the end. Well, yeah, that should work out. So I'm talking about architecture philosophy, but also I throw in art a little bit as well, because there's a parallel. And one of my topics is, when is architecture drawing in philosophy? It's usually at periods where the architecture is also drawing in art. And these are periods of uncertainty, of transformation, of, let's call them revolutionary periods. So that's one of the theses I throw in right at the beginning. And I hope I can demonstrate that. But of course, we also need to understand what the contribution architecture can expect from philosophy and how to interface with philosophy. So yeah, so how can philosophy contribute to architecture? That's the key question we have to ask. And so here's just throwing in some of the philosophers I've been reading over the years and appreciating, and I think I've learned from. And then I was reflecting, okay, and what have I actually learned from these? Can I sum that up? Can I, what was the contribution? I started to write down what these philosophers stand for me. You know, Peirce stands out, truth is success, pragmatism, and that's something I think is very important to realize, that we have to relate knowledge to action as a guide to action. Anyway, you'll see here many interesting insights. Kant, the order of the world is constituted by the human mind. That transcendental subject, which in the end turns out in the further development of Kantianism to be actually a social mind, societally construed through discourse. That subjectivity of worldview is another interesting insight. Anyway, I don't want to go through all of these. I'm just, you know, reviewing what I've been looking at and the figures, and I'm looking at what I call here the Pragmatist Convergence. I've kind of made that map of the various schools of philosophy and branches, and I'm distinguishing when it comes to that perspective of what I call the Pragmatist Convergence, this realization that philosophy, however abstract, profound, questioning it is, puzzling it is, full of, you know, paradoxes to be resolved, in the end it's also meant to be you know, orienting us and empowering us in the project of progressing that human civilization. So I'm looking more at that rather than individual happiness as a kind of agenda. So the Pragmatist Convergence, we have the you know, cognitivism on the right side, being, you know, initially the opposite of the pragmatist view. You have distinguished into the rationalists and the empiricists, which is in the way continental versus Anglo-Saxon, but in the later on you also have already both continental and Anglo-Saxon have these kind of proto-pragmatist strands where you can find, you know, Bentham and on the Anglo-Saxon strand, and Marx, Nietzsche, Dilthey, or Peirce on the Anglo-Saxon part. So, and they kind of converge, and in the end everything converges. Then it is down there as a kind of semi-excellent, but the time when I was putting that map up, I was, you know, going through all of Dennett's work. So, but I think what is helpful to discuss the question of what can philosophy contribute and what we can look for philosophers, we need to understand. I'm trying to classify philosophers and philosophies, and I've come up with those which are what they call the provocateurs and instigators. I put the line, these two are kind of connected up to some extent. And then we have those most elaborators, and in the end the synthesizers or systematizers, the great system builders. And that's where my sensitivity is. I mean, I think that the instigators and provocateurs have been very influential, and there we'll find, for instance, Deleuze and Guattari, or people like Derrida, Heidegger, etc. But we don't expect from them to really give the kind of complete picture in which we can embed the architectural project as part of the human project. I don't think we can expect it from these figures. And as you know, some of them, like Derrida, is, you know, explicitly denying the possibility, similar to Lyotard, of a grand narrative. But I think there is the possibility, there must be the possibility of, let's call it the grand narrative. And I'm looking at figures like initially Marx for many years, at my initial, let's say, intellectual awakening beyond Kant. And then later, recently more Habermas and Luhmann, and I should maybe add Hayek. So those philosophers, and they are deeply philosophical in their approach and encompassing in their systematic overview. In the end, they're more political philosophers and sociologists and social theorists, and developing a theory of society, but they're at the same time truly engaging with the deepest questions of philosophy also. These are the figures we can, I mean, look to for, let's say, overarching guidance, which then allows us to, what all the elements, the interesting inspirations which are brought in by the provocateurs and instigators, we can fit them into an overall project. So the functions of philosophy, at least latent or manifest, and some people might say, well, philosophy maybe doesn't have a function. I say, if it doesn't have a function, don't waste your time, or has some kind of contribution. So the one thing is obviously inspirational, conceptual creativity, which ends up oftentimes as abstract algebras of terms, and they make you feel dizzy, and you have lots of association, and you then try to think what in real life, in your world, you could use these terms for, you instantiate these terms, and that's already a kind of creative engagement process. And the people who stand for that mostly is Deleuze and Guattari, who have actually defined in what is philosophy as that kind of creation of concepts. And in 1,000 Plateaus, they describe how this is this kind of raw quarry on and the material which in the end lives through being connected up. It's a kind of abstract machine in itself, which lives and breathes and evolves as it is connected up into various scenarios and projects and so on. Then you have also those, and that connects up with that, the exchange hubs for new concept and modes of theorizing. So, and Deleuze Guattari, in a way, when they're very creative, and they will later on go through a lot of the concept they coined, they're not kind of sui generis creations, really. They're actually drawn from the various arenas of intellectual investigations, whether it's from the arts even, but from the various sciences, biology, sociology, history, political movements, etc., and their theorizing. So that's, and these different discourses, they obviously, they're often inward looking, and that's very important. They build up this internal complexity, and so they're not so much aware of each other. And then the philosopher comes in and kind of scans and devours all of them and synthesizes them and spreads them around to everybody. And you can see that this happens because of these kind of philosophers who take off. They have much higher volume of print volumes and circulation and recognition and usage, namely in all the disciplines. So when post-structuralism spread around, and every discipline had to rethink and self-criticize and absorb these insights. So that's a very important role, that exchange up for new concept and modes of theorizing. Things which start in one corner of let's say intellectual universe might be relevant to many others. For instance, when complexity theory emerged, and Deleuze-Guattari events jump on that and also spread this around. So the other thing which we sometimes find is at the frontier of science, you have this speculative proto-science. But it's also at the frontier of other function systems, for instance, economics or politics and political theory. You have philosophers are the ones who it's a bit like Daniel Dennett interfacing with and working with cognitive scientists as a steerer, as somebody who's helping to formulate research programs. So it's a bit more than an instigator and an inspiration, because it's actually getting into the weeds with research teams, etc. So then we have the rational reconstruction of science, the philosophy of science, where you have again somebody who's standing apart. And then trying to look at the sciences as a whole. There's also a bit of an exchange up condition, but there's one where you can start synthesizing and systematizing and critiquing. But one has to be careful. The philosophy of science had to learn that it can't be kind of abstractly critiqued, that it has to actually much more look at and abstract from how science really on the ground succeeds. And then I think the next one, which I find interesting as important, is the frontier for scientific unification. So it's the program of the unified sciences. It's always important. In each branch, actually, you have this tendency for continuous specialization. For instance, even in cognitive science or in AI, you have various branches, various techniques, various research programs and groups and projects which potentially develop their own terminology, criteria of success, paradigms, and you need to stand back and really try to, on the science basis, try to unify and integrate, so that results spreads around, and these specialist branches can communicate, but then also between sciences. The importance of having computer science and cognitive science already a hybrid discipline, but how that then feeds into for instance, economics and behavioral economics, etc. To have that unifying attempt, at least. It's a tough one. You can never fully succeed, but efforts in direction are very important. And I think in the end, with the pragmatist thrust, that this intellectual unification is not only a unification between the various intellectual projects and sciences, but it's actually unification to enhance an overall human project. And I think this is figures, for instance, like Habermas would stand for, trying to steer that and achieve that, and being a hub of reference. I mean, these also, you see, these kind of figures also become enormously important points of reference of cohering some kind of intellectual zeitgeist. Wow. So again, how can philosophy contribute to architecture? So in various ways, like described, as an updater, instigator, drawing in, let's say, advances and conceptual, as well as maybe technique-wise and methodological advances from other fields into architecture, because that's where you get the condensed kind of package of what's contemporaneous advanced intellectual repertoires. You get them in philosophy, and it's easier to get it there than to dive into all the different fields. You can do that also, and in each field you actually have quasi-philosophers. So the philosophy is also professional philosophers, pure philosophers, and then all those radical innovators and profound kind of people shaking up their fields. They become, in a sense, philosophers as well. So that is this updating thrust, but it's also the overall systematizing, orienting thrust. So these are the two contributions I would distinguish. Now, the important question I started with is, when has philosophy been brought into architecture? And here we have to notice that it's not always present in the field with the same degree of intensity. And my observation and then claim and thesis is that it is actually, if we look at it at the transitions, the paradigm shifts, which are at the same time also the shifts between the great epochal styles, which are the great paradigms of the field. When these paradigms run smoothly and you get into the weeds of executing and the detailing out and elaborating, and the big questions had been answered, as it were, and you can build on an accumulative, let's say, development project, then philosophy kind of recedes to the background. You focus more on application, execution. But then there are steerings of this, if these methods run aground to new societal development, new technological challenges. Often that's where developments also originate, and you can continue as usual, and you have to kind of engage with the fundamental directions the disciplines might go, fundamental values you've been taken for granted, all it's going to put in question, and then you have philosophers naturally kind of being looked for and joining in and being drawn in. Revolutionary periods of paradigm shift, of epochal shift between styles, and that's what I wanted to show. And I think actually that's at the same time art is brought into architecture at that point, because you're opening up the repertoire and you have that freewheeling exploration and brainstorming condition for which you use, in terms of formal tools and inspirations, you use art. And in terms of conceptual innovations and thinking through the agenda and maintaining on target, you use philosophy. So these two, both art and philosophy, are coming in at these transitional revolutionary periods. And I'm going to demonstrate that now in a few examples. And so I'm starting with, and it's rarely discussed actually, the heroes of modern architecture. When modernism finally emerged out of this transition from historicism, eclecticism, via transitional styles and periods like Art Nouveau and Expressionism, in the end, in the early 20s, you have that convergence towards what became the modern movement, modernism, modern functionalism. And what is, I don't have to illustrate, is the incredible contribution of art, abstract art, when you have, Mondrian and the style. You have the Russian constructivist building on, Malevich, etc., suprematism and constructivism as an art movement first before it becomes an architecture movement. So that's very clear. And if you look at the figures, this is Walter Gropius. I'm not sure if you recognize him. Walter Gropius to the left, the young Gropius, Le Corbusier, and Mies van der Rohe. You can see that these bohemians, they're basically artists. And particular, Le Corbusier started as an artist, so did Mies as a sculptor, and the three of them were working and that is now before that breakthrough of modern architecture before the 1920s. 1907 to around 1907, all three of them worked for Peter Behrens' office, an industrial designer and architect who himself came out of painting, came out of art. So the importance of art is clear. I also want to talk about, and that is clear also in these magazines, for instance, magazine like G, where Mies van der Rohe was very importantly involved in, and you can see the way this was interfacing with art forms like radical new art forms like film, and with manifesto style, the messages, film does not yet exist, just a perverse anomaly of photographed literature. So these are very, heady and intense times full of artistic energy. But it is also the period of philosophy. And philosophy comes in and becomes in, there's a slight shift in time, and I will show you which role philosophy played, in particular in the modern movement in the Bauhaus, towards that settling in on that radical, hard-nosed, radical functionalism, actually, which we're looking at. So, and when you look at the Bauhaus early, you can see the transition, when art is that transitional instigator, but it at the same time is only a transitional presencing, and then we have to move beyond art to get real, as it were. So if you look at Gropius, he brought in all the artists to the Bauhaus, and you can see the cast of character, these kind of romantic dreamers. You have Oskar Schlemmer, you have Johannes Itten, and you have Vasily Kandinsky. And this is the early 20s, they're arriving there. And then they're disappearing. The latter half, second half of the 1920s, because we at that point we're into industrial design and urban design, architectural design, and becoming real, taking on social responsibility, and where you also have to deliver technologically and economically, and you can imagine that the characters, the artists, are not necessarily have much to contribute anymore to that process. So what we're then seeing, it's quite fascinating, the figure who takes that on the most clearly is Hannes Meyer. Hannes Meyer will take over the Bauhaus from Gropius. Mies is of course in there as well, and there is a kind of culture clash. There's also the social responsibility, the social revolutions which took place in Germany and in Austria and in the Soviet Union, which Hannes Meyer is aligned to as a Marxist. But in terms of philosophy, it's very interesting. He invited the logical positivists to the Bauhaus selection. And that is Otto Noirat here, Rudolf Carnap, and Herbert Feigl, who are the absolute key figures of the first half of the 20th century philosophy, similar to actually Gropius and Mies and others. They also moved to America when fascism moved in, and they became major figures for Anglo-Saxon philosophy as well. So these are interesting. The logical positivism and architecture in the 1920s and 1930s, instantiated through the Bauhaus, but through other mechanisms as well. And logical positivism based on Ludwig Wittgenstein's work. It is in Wittgenstein, coming out of mathematics, mathematical logic, engineering degree in aerodynamics, at the beginning of flight, a super bright figure. And then the followers of Wittgenstein, the so-called Vienna Circle, were carrying through that program of a radical, let's say, sweeping away the cobwebs of historical philosophizing, of metaphysics, of romantic dreaming, and having a kind of technologically sharp, scientific approach to philosophy, to the social sciences, the sciences, of course, and to the project of human progress. And so it's very kind of cool and cold and sharp view, very much aligned to what we associate, of course, also kind of emotionally with modernism. So just look at Ludwig Wittgenstein's Spectators,
Patrik for a moment.
Early book. The world is all that is the case. Thesis 1, thesis 2. What is the case? The fact is the existence of state of affairs, etc., etc. These are, and just this kind of numbering system of theses and subsystems, sub-theses, very stern, very trying to be very precise, and in a sense shaking up philosophy through understanding what the constraints of generating meaning is, through understanding how language operates and structures thought. So what is interesting that with respect to Wittgenstein is that he became temporarily an architect as well. So he delivered his Spectators, and he thought he had cleared the cobwebs and re-established philosophy on a scientific path based on mathematical logic and radical empiricism in his attitude. And then he actually moved on to teach school children in the countryside, and in the end he designed this building for his sister, together with a student of Adolf Loos. And you can see the similarity of let's say attitude, which is trying to boil down the essential functionality and objectivity of a functional process, let's say. And Carnap is a fascinating character who wrote, his first major book was The Logical Structure of the World. And at the same time, he wrote Pseudo Problems in Philosophy, which was all about casting aside the metaphysics and re-establishing the scientific thinking. So logical constructions from sense data have to be substituted for inferred entities, the construction of that which is not seen from that which is seen. So it is deeply empirical based and doesn't allow for any anything else to gain currency intellectually if you can't kind of shake it out and tie it back down to the final given presences. And in the end, that mutates into pragmatics. We have also, a few years later, the article, which is with this kind of beautiful name, The Elimination of Metaphysics Through Logical Analysis of Language. And the thesis here is that all metaphysics, and that includes at that point the works of Heidegger, are literally meaningless. So, quote, in saying that the so-called statements of metaphysics are meaningless, we intend this word in its strictest sense. But it's not only negative, not only destructive, it's also constructive, like the, that project of the logical construction of building up physics, chemistry, etc., from the ground up, from the sense data, from the initial givens. And then he developed actually this approach of building up artificial languages and building up grammar systems in which grammatical correctness at the same time guarantees a logical well-formedness. So by the logical syntax of a language, we mean the systematic statement of the formal rules which govern it, together with the development of the consequences which follow from these rules. The system of a language, when only the formal structure is considered, is a calculus. The two different kinds of rules are those which we have previously called rules of formation and transformation. So it's building up nearly like an axiomatic system. It's a language system which then can absorb, through which you can express the various sciences, that's the hope. And those which resist this expression, finally, that parts need to be kind of cast aside as vague and unproductive. I mean, this program was very radical, was very sharp, fascinating, and had an enormous impact, particularly then also in the US. And in the sense, what comes out of this is, computer science, formal system thinking, the student, Gödel, people like Turing are inspired, of course, by this. So there's a huge kind of programming language in the way, kind of build on that, a whole new impact. But the project itself was not really possible in the end to pull off, to bring everything, under one kind of formalism and say that's it. And Gödel, with this kind of incompleteness theorem, already kind of gave early hints of that. Anyway, so I find it fascinating. The connections are quite, widespread and deep between logical positivism and functionalism of the 1920s and 1930s. So Otto Noirat, who was one of the key members of the Vienna Circle, also a socialist, by the way. He was the director of the Museum of City Planning in Vienna. And Josef Frank was the designer of the museum. His brother was a member of the Vienna Circle. As I said, Noirat, Karner, Feigl were all brought to the Bauhaus for full lecture series, and I will show you later some of the titles. And then we have SIAM inviting Noirat to become a member and to participate in their 4th Congress on the functional city. Also, we have Noirat, in a sense, becoming some kind of visual language designer with this kind of isotype languages to express statistical information, etc., visualization language. Okay, Hannes Meyer is maybe the figure, together with Mart Stam and Hans Schmidt, as well as perhaps Elisitsky, the ABC group, the most radical end of the functionalist agenda, rejecting all art and rejecting vagueness, rejecting aesthetics, actually. And I think they were wrong in that, but it was an important step at that stage to have to pull away all prejudice and look sharply and with a cold view on requirements and how they might be addressed. So Hannes Meyer, and you can see that the spirit is very much similar to the logical positivists. So none of these, so all things in this world are a product of the formula function times economy. I don't want to read much more here, talking about the rejection of art, etc. Highly materialist and reductive, if you can, conception. Now, so that's one episode, and you can see that's the heroes of modernism. And when you then go through the 40s, 50s, 60s, there isn't that intense engagement with philosophy perhaps anymore, but we're now looking at the period, I think, where something new starts to emerge, a new level of complexities, and we have starting to see complexity theory happening, cybernetics and so on. And so in the 60s, something new comes in. And also you have, the 60s are really a period of social transformation, societal transformation. So we have the next kind of episode maybe where philosophy is drawn in a bit more. And one interesting character is this Doxiadis, who created, talking about acoustics, the science of human settlement, and he has this kind of series of Delos symposia from 63 to 75, where they had brought in major, philosophers and like Margaret Mead and Marshall McLuhan, but also sociologists and, innovative theoretical biologists like Conrad Waddington. So that's an interesting kind of start. And you can see some of the covers of acoustics. It has this kind of a complexity interest. And Wrigley wrote about, Wrigley, I think, wrote about a book on these kind of so-called the network fever of that period, networks fever. I think we're still in a networks fever, by the way. But it started there, and he also is mentioning Doxiadis. It's fascinating stuff. And that connects up with Cedric Price, because we're talking about the integration of cybernetics into architecture. And this is, Gordon Pass is that kind of British cyberneticist from the first hours, and he was in particular then evolving into so-called second order cybernetics, a concept developed by Hans von Förster. So there's a deeply philosophical engagement with Cedric Price and him collaborating on the Fun Palace in '64. Wait. And here we have Gordon Pass at the A, and there's anything that show at the AA, and this takes off in the late 60s with the so-called cybernetic serendipity. It's a show at the ICA. We have a lot of early computer art, and it's an interesting period. And we have Ranulph Glanville, who just recently passed away, and he was actually in and outside architecture for a long while, but he's a major contributor to the international cybernetics discourse, with papers in connection with all the main cyberneticians like Förster. He was actually Theo Spiropoulos' PhD advisor. And this is he studied at the AA first, and you can see what he's developed, this something which looks like a kind of Uber Eats or something diagram for an absentee shopping system, like a flow diagram. So that's before he got under the influence, surely, of Gordon Pask in 1970. He then moved on to do his PhD in cybernetics. I forgot where, maybe the Royal, the Imperial College or somewhere like that. And then came back later on also to teach in architecture. But he's really has some serious in deep papers, and I know that because Niklas Luhmann, who's my great hero and intellectual synthesizer, sociologist who absorbed a lot of the cybernetics and second order cybernetics discourses, Otto Noirat, in his work, and he's citing Glanville and as somebody who has innovative ideas worth looking at. And John Fraser comes out of this as well. And now we're looking ahead as with these kind of algorithmic proliferation systems, based on some of past ideas. In the mid 90s, we already arrived there. So it's difficult to make that that story synchronous, but you have, of course, in the 60s, again, late 50s, 60s, and the Situationists with Neuwenhuis and Guy Debord, Asker John and Asker Jorn, and they are kind of, again, art and philosophy and radical practice. You can see that's a new thing. It's really starting to be something that's interested in complexity and in free-flowing explorations, the dérive, the détournement. These concepts are, of course, radical concepts, beautiful concepts. Then, so you start, this movement is typical, similar, let's say, to some extent you can compare to Bauhaus. It starts very artistic, with artistic practice and, radical philosophical concepts of the period, the naked city, the psychographic map of Paris, and that's the kind of late 50s. 10 years later, so in the 60s, it starts that they become more serious, they want to impact more, they become political in this case. And of course, you can imagine that with the upheavals of the student, emerging student revolution, etc., you will have that. And what actually Debord did, he turned the Situationist movement more into a political activist group, and basically they expelled or disenfranchised all the artists. So something quite similar. And he became more of a serious philosopher. He wrote, the Society of the Spectacle, for instance, along Marxist lines. So that's the trajectory. So this kind of shift from artistic practice and a certain kind of philosophy which borders on poetry inspiration to more kind of rigorous philosophy, and then the artists disappear. So that's what you get, and you get these kind of. If you look at this meeting, that's probably a kind of strategic party meeting, nearly, rather than kind of artistic practice. But again, and we have philosophy interfacing with architecture in the Situationist movement. And we were anticipating what we're talking about later in terms of is post-structuralism. You can see here in the 60s, you have a lot of these revolutionary spirit, and you have demonstrations and other events. I don't know what the event here is, but you see Jean-Paul Sartre, Gilles Deleuze, and Michel Foucault, some kind of event here in 1972. And we have in architecture, responses to that, which are, highly provocative, dystopian. This is Super Studio interfacing with that and absorbing, I'm sure, so the respective philosophies. And again, all of that is revolutionary philosophy. It's all some form of neo-Marxism, if you like. The autonomia movement was very strong, getting strong in Italy, had a big impact, out of which come kind of negri-guattari as well. And but what I wanted to show also, there's some, it's not only what's happening in the street, it's what's happening in business, in that translation into post-Fordism, which I was interested in to see. So this is kind of not a super studio, crazy vision. This is, the most productive firms getting the kind of flexible Bürolandschaft, and at the same time you have management discourse of lowering hierarchies, and you have a network companies emerging. And so that whole thing, which was reflected in the discourse of post-Fordism, I keep harping on about and I keep pointing towards, which is actually a Marxism take on what was going on in the economy, and seen as with a lot of liberation potential, and the kind of decentralization and which we saw in the business organizations and business processes. We also saw in the political counterculture away from Stalinist or Leninist, Marxist-Leninist cadre parties, democratic centralism, to these kind of free flow of struggles, which you see in the autonomia movement, which in the end is also kind of theorized and in Deleuze-Guattari's work. And then the way we tried in the 90s to pick that up and turn and radicalize it into three-dimensional Bürolandschafts. So again, revolutionary period, revolutionary ideas, and a new philosophy. So I will come to that now in terms of deconstructivism. That's maybe the period deconstructivism and into the early pragmatism of folding in architecture. That's maybe the period where the interaction between architecture and philosophy was most visible, most direct, because we have the figures. Philosophers are not only read by architects, but the philosophers come in and engage. I mean, to some extent, in the Situationist movement, you had that aspect already. So we have, of course, the deconstructivist show at MoMA, and we have these collaborations with Derrida, with Eisenman, as well as with Bernard Schumi coming in and being reflected in that term deconstructivism, which comes from Derrida's, of course, notion of deconstruction, and the way that whole generation of architects, at least through it, those of this generation who were theoretically minded, like Schumi and Eisenman and perhaps Koolhaas, were strongly influenced by post-structuralism and deconstruction in terms of their conceptual insights and loosening up and breaking up that, let's say, simple modernization trajectory, which was anyway going astray in the 60s and 70s. It's interesting that this movement, the movement of deconstructivism, has both these elements: those thinkers who talk to philosophers directly, and then those maybe creative artists. So on the thinker side, you could say, yeah, there was Eisenman, Schumi, Rem. On the artistic innovator side, you had Zaha, Wolf Briggs, Frank Gehry, and then you have Liebeskind, who is, I don't know, is somewhere in between, a kind of poet, thinker, artist. So you have these two worlds represented, and this is, Gehry, and as you can see that sometimes earlier artistic practices, which were dysynchronously then reabsorbed, like Schwitter's Märzbau, for instance, which had no role in modernist architecture proper. Similarly, the Zaha's rediscovery and Rem's rediscovery of the Russian constructivists and their complex compositional strategies. Manhattan Transcript by Schumi. These were the kind of works of the heady days of deconstructivism. You can see the radical innovations like superposition, collaging operations, and you can see the way the product. This is a book which is attributed to Derrida and Eisenman, the choral works, and the way they're presented as a piece of where artistic practice enters directly into the discourse, even if you look at the pages, the graphic design of Derrida's works. Okay, so wait, need to. So in terms of the lessons, the post-structuralist, input through figures like Barthes, Foucault, Derrida, Lyotard, and Baudrillard, the notion of the end of the grand narratives, that kind of, most of them were ex-Marxist, but there wasn't anymore that single narrative of the great transformation from capitalism to socialism to communism. The death of the author, so that we substitute nearly by kind of discourse and intertextuality, the three counts of kind of signifiers. There's an anti-humanism and anti-essentialism there. The dependency on any concept, thinking on an historically, it's a transitory episteme. So you're embedded in categorical structures you inherit, and there might be kind of power determined. That's Foucault. The idea of discursive structures, very interesting for architects, that in these discourses, they're not only formed through language and concepts which are inherited and that's it, but with discursive practice which involve also architectural structures. The university as a building, the clinic, the asylum, the prison, all these, and you could say as well the kind of the bureau, the office buildings, the way they structure a hierarchy and hierarchize and access control, interaction process and discourse, because also the sciences then operate with them. Hyper reality, simulation. So these are the concepts which we've absorbed and they become second nature. And I think Neil in his kind of ontology is kind of then allowing that to feed into and show to architecture. So the way these philosophers, of course, we not all can shake hands with Derrida or Baudrillard, but these figures appeared, and there were the any conference where they come to where you can really get a direct interfacing. But otherwise, you also need the kind of the architectural theorists to become the transmission bell for these new currents into architecture. Neil played this role, and many others. And we had some philosophers like Mark Cousins and Andrew Benjamin and etc. Who come in and actually then teach in architecture school, and later on people like Delanda and Quinter do this as well. So here's Derrida, and you can see Derrida's deconstructing, against logocentrism, against the metaphysics of presence, against the completeness and stability of meaning. Very productive, very interesting, and opened up and untethered in a sense the design development process, and it was some kind of laissez-faire to some extent, but also the alertness then to re-script and re-embed. But at that point, Derrida was an absolute intellectual superstar, and you can see he was kind of, I don't know where his photograph comes out. He was maybe photographed for front covers, etc. And you had, of course, the great MoMA show, which is a big institutional push for that, to bring that through. But it was overall, it was one of those transitional styles. It didn't last that long. He moved on, very soon. Let's say 10-year stint. When Derrida's book came out, so Vigli's book finally came out, it took him too long. It was already moving somewhere else. So, so the creative architectural exploitation of the philosophy of Derrida, undermining architectural order, the architectural metaphor was reflected as a metaphor of intellectual structure as well, rejecting metaphysics present. I had that radical relationism. There's always what something means and represents, and it's always part of a network. It always absences, which at the same time kind of established when you set a presence. That fantastic concept of difference, where you have the continual deferral of the system of differences never being stable. First of all, that the element is of course only defined through the differences all the other elements, and can never stand alone, but this kind of systems relations in continuous flux, and therefore you have that kind of continuous becoming of meanings, and that means also the space of becoming and the productive ambiguity, intertextuality, mining context for colliding contradictory forces, the free play of the signifier, the emancipation from familiar stable forms of meaning, the search of new meaning. So these are the things we've learned, and they remain important. And then you have the kind of the artistic trailblazers like Wolf Pricks architecture must burn. They have kind of the artistic parallel to that, let's say, and with poetry and visual and three-dimensional poetry, as well as with Zaha's, fantastic breakthroughs and radical innovations, which I'm not going to talk to so much about it here in Liebeskin. These kind of artistic projects, which were kind of validated and theoretically kind of guarded and filled with potential, as it were allowed to be happening. And you can imagine that a Carnap or a Hannes Meyer would just simply stop these things in its track, and the verdict would be of utter meaninglessness, and that kind of allowing that emergent characteristics and properties might later on be functionalized and refunctionalized. That was learned through the post-structuralist. And of course, Deleuze and Guattari, in a sense, aligned with the next kind of shift from deconstructivism into folding and pragmatism. They were, of course, also very intricately aligned with this. So it's a kind of smooth transition. It's not a new epochal rift. It's actually the elaboration of that epochal rift to the next level of intricacy and complexity, and where they bring in a lot of the complexity theory discourse and a lot of what happened in the political autonomia movement discourse. They brought that into their discourse and have this kind of fantastic philosophy, which hovers somehow between philosophy, poetry, art, artistic practice. And I first encountered Thousand Plateaus in 1987 already. So it was maybe before it's part of the deconstructivist trajectory, particularly the first chapter on the rhizome. We were reading at the Southern University with Kevin Robert, and when we got into this world. So, but then he really took off, of course, several years later, only in the early 90s, where Deleuze and Guattari's works kind of spreading into, let's say, every architecture school and every theorist and ambitious architect. It came through initially also through this idea of the fold. That's a bit kind of superficial and trivial nearly. It's not for sure not its best book, and quite a bit later than Thousand Plateaus. But you can see that there's a diagram straight from I don't know which page it is on, from Gilles Deleuze's The Fold, which initiated folding in architecture to some extent. And actually what is interesting that Gilles Deleuze was also in contact with architects. He was actually on that page where he is showing this diagrams, he's actually citing and referring to Bernard Cash, a book which he must have met. Bernard Cash must have been seeing the manuscript, must have read a book which came out only several years later, only in 95, only in English, but the French version Deleuze was aware of when he wrote The Fold. Actually, the Cash's book was originally, the manuscript was available since 1983. It was only published in 1995 as Earth Moves. So there was a direct connection, the engagement of Deleuze with architecture through Bernard Cash. That's the book, which I remember when it came out. And then the fold, Le Pli, the folding, of course, the first project, 1990, the Frankfurt Rebstock project, Eisenman architect, and I suspect Greg Lynn was already involved in the Eisenman office here, as he took it on and took it further with his sketch projects. I think is his final thesis project. And then with his writings, what came out then was Assemblage 19, with this fantastic book on inorganic bodies. And the Greg Lynn writings were the ones who brought in not only Deleuze Guattari and some of their concepts, but also Darcy Thompson, Waddington, and many others. And then we have folding in architecture, the AD, in 1 year later. That's 93, I think. with Kipnis, Kipnis and Draglin with key articles. But we have the whole kind of group of figures at Columbia University with Stan Allen and Field Conditions, and everybody in that year 93. There were so many, whether it's at Columbia University and around Columbia University, who just homed in on this. There was a total fast convergence around this new paradigm and absorbing these philosophies and concepts. And I will show you later that we participated as well when we were in 93 at Columbia University teaching. So then we have the Anyway conference, and that's where you really get the philosophers and architects into a kind of a regular exchange. Yearly conferences planned, I think for 10 years with anyone in any way. These are the characters they had brought in. These were the architects, and you can see Jacques Derrida, Kojin Karatani, Roberto Ungar, Gianni Vattimo were the philosophers, but I think also you could, Jameson and Reichman are philosophers, if you like. Art historians, etc. So this is the first any conference, and that kept going for another 10 years, with anywhere, any place, anytime, anymore, blah 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 blah. So these were heady days, and we discussed a day at DRL. We were reading, Deleuze and Guattari. Particularly, the Southern Plateau was a big thing. So all these concepts, I mean, they are talking earlier, the kind of philosophy as the creators of concepts, but at the same time, these concepts are not, there may be new phrases, new coins, very importantly, but what underlies them has been drawn in from all the different disciplines and intellectual currents, complexity theory and political theory of the autonomia movement, etc., lies behind that, as well as anti-psychiatry movement, etc. So you have the rhizome, you have nomadology, smooth versus striated space, continuous variation, assemblage, which is instead of versus organism, the body without organ, lines of flight, the molecular versus the molar, deterritorialization, the virtual versus the actual, intensities, multiplicities, etc., etc., abstract machines, diagrams. I mean, this, you can see, it's a lot of concepts, a lot of hooks. They have got tie-in, there's some kind of a system, some of them mean similar things, but that's been incredibly important that we have that layer of, and then these were picked up and worked up into architectural, let's say, conceptual repertoires through Draglin and Kipnis in particular. And then there were others, I think, like Quinter was more just throwing the stuff and presenting things, and it was Greg and Kipnis, Jeff, who developed into architectural theory, and that was very exciting. And we got a new movement, a new language with new forms, techniques, and tools and concepts. What we didn't have is an overall comprehension of how this feeds into a progressive project of this civilization moving forward. And that where I saw my role, integrating that with what was happening in the economy, with corporate restructuring efforts, with sociological and political agendas and movement, how this ties in with urban processes, etc., which are in the end societal processes. And but that you couldn't find in this crop of inspirational philosophers. For that you need to go elsewhere. Okay, so this is what we what emerged in '93 with respect to myself and Zara teaching at Columbia with a team, and this kind of intensified layered urbanism, which at the same time where the elements compress, inflect, react to each other. It's kind of a proto-parametricism, which we established in trying to use a computer for the first time as well. Ubiquitous urbanism at the time. And then, a few years later, that movement took off. It created the show Latent Utopias with all of the protagonists. And I will end and show, that a lot of this is still and was at the time still artistic practice as well coming in. Of course, the art world has professional artists who just do stuff, which radiates out, but it is also a space where ambitious designers, architects can go in and use the resources and publicity machine in budgets to generate the architectural projects and use the artwork. So like Mark Fons and others. And we've done that many times. We had shows at the ICA where we used those budgets to create installations as our first kind of constructs for you know, and so we have Mark Fons, and but we also have, you know, computer scientists and artists like Chris Rea, and we have a lot of that. Parametricism has also that kind of artistic trajectory, as well as the philosophical trajectory, but then at a later stage also the transformation into real purposes where the contribution of artists recedes a bit of the background, and we get more hardcore technology, science, engineering, but for me also in the end kind of social functionality research and agent-based modeling of, you know, life processes, how they facilitated by these new morphologies in the new society under these guidance of these new philosophical concepts. Now I want to end with showing you that, yes, so in the end I'm moving and still with the figures like Jürgen Habermas and Niklas Luhmann, theory of communicative action, the social systems theory. I'm adding to this and we developed in this kind of systematizing theory of architecture. And by the way, these figures, a figure like Luhmann, of course, he has absorbed, I mean, he's a great kind of figure who's brought cybernetics, second order cybernetics, autopoiesis and complexity theory into the social sciences and social theory and theory of society. But also, of course, he has absorbed a lot of, and as I thought, he read Pask and Glanville and these figures and Hans von Förster and many others, but he also is fully aware and engaging with Foucault, but particularly also with Derrida, etc. So he is absorbing these new loops and integrating these new loops of reflection and uncertainty and contingency, and yet is trying to re-establish a new, let's say, grand narrative, if you like, on a new level of complexity. Maybe not so much with the activist forward thrust, but Habermas is the one who's been doing this as well, and he's engaging, has been engaging, of course, also with people like Foucault, and as a critical engagement. And it's simply what I have to say: you can't a Derrida or a Deleuze or Baudrillard, not even a Foucault, none of them you can go to for a comprehensive theory of society where they take, let's say, responsibility through their orienting and guiding discourse and taking the world, the social world and the human progress onto their shoulder. There's no way that they will ever even be prepared to do that and could do that. None of the resources of the stamina don't have that sensibility. So that's the kind of figure we still, I think, need. And these are the true, let's say, followers, or you take the baton for somebody like Marx, who took it maybe from Hegel, who took it from Kant. This is the great kind of philosophical tradition which we need to look towards, and that tradition needs to continue as well. So I wrote my works in this spirit, with all the kind of inspirational and innovation and creative concepts absorbed, and then try to kind of integrate and systematize and pragmatically instrumentalize it. And of course, I recently discovered also a Hayek and the whole world of libertarian economics. But you can see Hayek was also, again, that guy who was one of the first in the social science and economics to interface with cybernetics, with complexity theory, and the lessons which come out of that in terms of complex bottom-up processes. He's a great kind of visionary figure in precisely that ambit as well. So it fits. It makes sense. And I end with this graph where I've kind of the figures which I can still relate to, and how they are, the coherencies between them, despite the kind of epochal shifts which we've gone through, is this idea of being materialist, of emphasizing evolutionary processes and evolution as history as evolution, the importance of reflecting language, but pragmatically, the importance of sociology, social theory, and economy, which is a bit less strong in figures like Habermas, the attempt of totalizing or full integration, and in the end, the outlook on activism. So that's my pitch, and I will open up the debate with this.
Thanks, Patrik. That was great. That was great. I don't want to talk, but I got maybe two comments that I would like want to kind of throw in there. I think, because actually, interestingly, I was talking yesterday and saying something very different in the sense that. So I think you're looking at it very much from a lens of an architect, and it's very difficult to think how you would look at it from the lens of a philosopher, in the sense of whether philosophers would agree. To my mind, what was interesting, I mean, you mentioned Bernard Cash being the one architect who worked with Deleuze. There's also, in terms of Derrida, Doina Petrescu, of course, did study under, as an architect, study under Derrida. And she told me once that she was part of he was invited to judge some art competition or something, or an exhibition or something. And she said, really, he had no clue. We had no clue about any of these things at all. And he was basically a philosopher. And there is a line you can take by, if you look at the kind of responses within the world of philosophy to this architectural engagement. I mean, I twice heard Derrida give lectures where people are said, so how does the work of Schumi and Eisenman connect with your thinking? And he would take exactly the same line each time, and he would pause for about half a minute, silence, and then he said, maybe it's better to not respond than to respond irresponsibly, a typical kind of wordplay that was going on. But the line that he basically was taking, and you can see it in this particular article that he published against engaging with Eisenman in Assembly 11 or 12, I think it was, where basically he trashes Eisenman. He said, listen, you misunderstand me completely. And so the way that I take this is a combination of both kind of notion that Harold Bloom has of this notion of creative misunderstanding, that basically, in some ways it's okay. Architects radically misunderstood what was going on in terms of philosophy, but they did something creative with it. So that's fair enough. My particular line is to say that it's to say that there's I introduced this term yesterday called architecturalization, whereby architects, they see these concepts such as the fold or deconstruction, they recognize that this seems to refer to something maybe architectural in some way, or at least they think it does, and then they kind of start generating this artwork. But the problem is, to my mind, deconstruction has got nothing to do with architectural form. The fold is about folds of thought, nothing to do with things. So there's this kind of interesting kind of misunderstanding that goes on, which is in some ways kind of like incredibly productive, in the stuff that comes out. But to my mind, it's possibly it's a complete to my mind, it's a misunderstanding. I certainly noticed that you mentioned that deconstructivism kind of died out. Maybe this is wrong, but I kind of would locate the moment which it died out with the point where Derrida takes on Eisenman and says, you don't understand me at all. Maybe not. I mean, I think this is what I would say is that architects are incredibly good at taking inspiration from other fields. I mean, not just art, philosophy, but other fields. And I once had someone from media art tell me that she thought all architects were like magpies. They would steal these kind of glittery ideas and just appropriate them in some way. And that's kind of in a way backed up by a comment that Ed Soja once made. Ed Soja gave a lecture at the AA, and he asked Moysen how would the students respond? And Moysen said, well, they will treat you like a gorilla in a cage. The more excited you get, the more they'll get interested, and they'll be very polite, and they'll take down notes, and they'll incorporate whatever you said into their next architectural project. And that, to my mind, is the real thing. Kind of somehow architects feed off these things as inspiration, but radically misunderstand them in a very, very creative and interesting way. So let me just throw that out there as a counter view to that.
Yeah, but there's some of this going on. But I do believe that in my mind, there is a lot which remains valid. There's a kind of process of insight which ties into these works and how we speak about these works and how we critique them, how we see them, what we recognize, the tolerance and intolerances. I mean, there's definitely that discourse there was an injection of a new level of sophistication and intelligence. So the post-structuralist kind of enlightenment, let's call it that, paradoxically, took place. And I do think it's a better fit, and you get more scope of allowing these insights to be had in these more complex works where multiple reference systems intersect, for instance, or where you have suddenly a gradient, or where you have this idea of the virtual through, like in the virtual house competition, through a kind of excessiveness of formal structures, which in the end deny that easy falling back into routines and fixed types and so on. So I do think that I mean, and yes, there's superficialities initially, but there is something which remains, and which we have absorbed, and which becomes, after several student generations and young architects who learn it in the crits, they don't know necessarily, they don't have to read the text and references, but it has trickled down, it has filtered through, it has worked, both in formal repertoires and in conceptual repertoires and in argument structures and so on. And I think that's why it also was important always to bring in, you have Geoff Bennick, you have Andrew Benjamin, you have Mark Cousins, you have these guys sitting on, somebody like you sitting in juries, Sanford Quinter and so on, and then of course Greg and Jesse and so on, and I think also Alejandro, and there are enough leaders both on the theory side and as well as philosophers and architects who understand what's going on, so that this comes through. So that's what I believe. So it wasn't a washout, and that if deconstructivism evolved to something else, it's because there's more and more richness and intensity and further progress in what became folding. And I was the one who was always kind of pushing for, it seemed as if we lost some and gained some. We lost, for instance, gradients and in the sense what you can say fuzzy logic conditions with the blobs. But I was insisting to bring in the layering and multiplicity and some of the deconstructivist discoveries there, and let's say sublate them in a Hegelian sense nearly into the project. So for me it was never lost. That's why important sometimes to have those of us who are a little bit older have seen many more things. We don't have this amnesia, and that's why I'm not sure you see my article on O, when certain things maybe need to be re-injected. It wasn't all that original. We had it in there. It was the Deleuzian virtual versus actual, that kind of, the inaccessibility, the opaqueness, the excessiveness of the thing, which is never exhaustible and exhausted. This is precisely these discourses which were reiterated and now condensed into this object conditions, where the fact that the discrete object is not relevant here. What is relevant here is the complexity and impenetrability of its structure and the continuous, let's say, surprise that it throws up and readings and multiple readings. So it's very important. So I do think these lessons are learned. They maybe have to be relearned. And the tough one for me was that you have to, at the same time you ramp up. So we said at DOL, we had all these, the philosophy books were slowly substituted by software manuals. And we had to, and also the technical knowledge and so on. And if you have always new generations, and we're trying hard to keep that consciousness alive of why we're now using, how this ties in, the robotic manufacturing ties in with some of these concepts and delivers towards that kind of smooth space, let's say, and a space of maybe even complexity and contradiction and difficult holes. I mean, even these concepts, there's a continuity out of that into deconstructivism, into folding and Deleuzian folding, because for me it's one big transition from modernism to what I call pragmatism, from Fordism to the post-Fordist network society. So, and it's very important to have that people in there all the way through and remind ourselves and try to plow this back into every new generation, but it's tough because what they have to absorb, the first generation had to kind of 50% Deleuze and the other 50% was kind of Form Z or whatever, and now we only have 5% time for for Deleuze. But we should still recognize it, and including also, I mean, deconstruction in this sense is absorbed into what we are now. It's not cast aside.
Yeah, maybe I can pick up on that question about the software. I mean, so the one person I thought was kind of interesting in your list was Alan Turing. I mean, ostensibly a kind of mathematician. Clearly, I mean, absolutely brilliant individual, as we're now discovering. I mean, an incredibly interdisciplinary. That, you know, what he was working on was it really strayed all over the place. It was amazing, and of course, he did have direct engagements with philosophy because he had this famous argument with Wittgenstein, and and so on. But in some ways, one of the comments that I kind of think is really important is, I mean, it's just an off-the-cuff comment, but Stephen Hawking makes a comment, made a comment that saying the problem with philosophy today is it fails to keep pace with technological change and science and so on. And that to my mind, is a kind of an important one. And I guess what I would have, I would maybe have, I'm not, this is your presentation, but I would have maybe incorporated some reference to what seems to be the new evolving discourse. In some sense, to me, that continental philosophy or the philosophy, pure philosophy, has given way to a new kind of, let's say, theoretical background, theoretical discourse called cognitive science. In other words, what you're finding is a kind of new constellation that is more engaging with science and computation, and in particular, whereby neuroscience, kind of AI, and a version of philosophy, which is a cognitive science version of philosophy, is becoming important. So I'm thinking here in particular of the work of Andy Clark, and the way that he engaged with David Chalmers. Especially the early work that they did on the extended mind becomes absolutely kind of crucial. And now David Chalmers himself, who I see in some ways, I mean, David Chalmers went to Oxford to study as a Rhodes Scholar to do mathematics of all things, whereas Wittgenstein had a background in engineering, but they're kind of parallel in an interesting kind of way. And I had a discussion with Sanford the other day where Sanford was saying, yeah, actually, David Chalmers is kind of like a logical positivist in some way. But anyway, David Chalmers is now, he's about to publish a book on virtual reality. And I think there's a kind of another domain that is opening up that is engaging with this kind of technological landscape in a more productive way and shifting things. I personally think that out of AI, we're getting some other insights as well. But it's that kind of shift towards things. And equally within neuroscience, you're getting people like Anil Seth, who are kind of philosophers. I mean, that's the interesting thing, is that the term consciousness is being addressed simultaneously by these philosophers like David Chalmers, and also the neuroscientists. So to my mind, there's a new field of inquiry that's opening up that is really destabilizing things, and it's using this world of technology in an interesting way. And as a final comment, I would say that the other person I think that I would have definitely included in some way in a list of provocateurs would be Zizek. And I think that
Sure.
Not least because he was with us the other day, but Zizek has this absolutely incredibly insightful essay that I published in Designing for a Digital World years ago, called from virtual reality to the virtualization of reality, where he uses virtual reality as a way of thinking through the question of reality itself. So to my mind, I think we have to engage with this new kind of technologically informed discourse that is not pure philosophy, but is something else. It's mutated and is kind of incredibly productive in what it's and provocative.
I mean, absolutely. Yeah. So I accept that, and I know that's a new kind of frontier. I had it in one of the categories, this kind of engaging at the frontier of science, a kind of proto-science, a projection. I mean, Dennett is a figure from Museway I mentioned, and Andy Clark and figures like that will be similar. And the cognitive science is fantastic intersection between neuroscience, the computer science, and all this machine learning stuff. And there's a lot of philosophy in there. And Google also, by the way, the Google guys, they invite philosophers and philosophers of consciousness into their ambit. And I've seen it actually already in 20 years ago with British BA systems, where they were looking at philosophers as well. I mean, so definitely, I just thought, for me, these, I don't see the impact on a new architecture as yet. I mean, that's what coming through the AI processes you're looking at closely, where something comes in. So I'm still on a trajectory where I've migrated away from well, look, the cognitive science things is interesting for me for what I call a phenomenological project, and that is very important, and we need to start modeling that as well. So I was interested in Delanda working on perception. It's very, very fascinating, and we all share the same sensibility in terms of the action orientation for perception, but also action orientation for theory. The materialism which comes through in Sanford's. I think we share these paradigms. They're very widespread and shared, and I'm fully aware, and I see the importance. Philosophy isn't that kind of abstracted armchair operation anymore. There's also experimental philosophy now. There's game theory. And I want to say one more thing, which is for me fascinating right now. I'm looking a lot recently at the cryptocurrency space and the blockchain ecosystems which are emerging around Ethereum and decentralized finance. It's fascinating, and it's interesting. They also look at some philosophers. I was curious that I recently saw that they're citing Bertrand Russell and Sol Kripke, so which maybe makes sense from a computer science perspective. But it's interesting. Maybe they need also some kind of upgrading with respect to more advanced philosophers, who they're referring to. But it's a fascinating space, and I see philosophers in the weeds at these frontiers. I find that very exciting.
Yeah, I would simply add to that. I mean, there's something to my mind that is emerging, and it's yet to kind of crystallize itself, but you see it as an interaction between different discourses right now. I mean, there's one, for example, I'd say, between the world of neuroscience and the world of AI. And I think it's really interesting that you get neuroscientists who are trained in AI as a PhD, and then people with PhDs in AI become neuroscientists. And it's almost like the conclusion I came to was that the interest in AI is actually the interest in intelligence itself. In other words, there is a kind of philosophical underpinning behind all that kind of work. At the same time, alongside that, you're getting AI artists like Sofia Crespo, for example, who are kind of referring to neural design and things, and we don't know quite what it is, and it's kind of a slightly loose kind of use of language. But in that kind of Venn diagram, which is kind of, I guess, at the moment it's art and neuroscience and AI, and I guess architecture comes in as well. In that intersection, there is something very rich emerging. And quite how we understand it and interpret it and things, but it seems to me that is the kind of battlefield or the most productive field at the moment.
Yeah, and the one thing I also want to mention is, that philosophy kind of migrates into agent-based modeling as well. So we have now the modeling of moral sensibilities of strategies, and it's an evolutionary game theory. A model in agent-based modeling, and for modeling moral precepts and moral strategies and sensibilities and conceptions, the co-evolution of altruism and cooperative kind of interactions is fascinating. So that the technologization of philosophy, which in a way started with the logical positivists, is still ongoing and continuing. And for me, that's a fantastic world out there where we should absorb more into our discourse, in our capacities. That's what I'm working on, all these life process modeling and these agent-based modeling for both populations and occupancy processes with complex heterogeneous populations, but also with respect to the various architectural elements which might have interaction protocols and utility maximizing strategies and game theoretic strategies to maximize their utilization and so on. It's a fascinating world. I'm looking at that right now, and the interfacing of these agent-based systems, where they also do what we're doing, which is overlaying, let's say, network structured, so it's a kind of a socially network structured population, which is engaging and evolving. So it's a fascinating world, and that's kind of philosophy. So there is a kind of experimental philosophy in this way.
There are a couple of questions in the chat, and I just want to invite anyone else to ask a question.
Yeah, I'm maximum 10 minutes, so I'm sorry. We got.
Okay. Well, this is a quick one. Okay, from Andrea Macruz, who is one of the Tongji doctoral candidates. Patrik, can you indicate any book, author of philosophy, evolutionary biology, or social cognitive science that discusses human survival, advantageous characteristics, performance, capacities, functionality, etc.?
Well, yeah, I think basically, I mean, evolutionary theory is the master theory in a way for me. The theory of evolution, and which now translates, of course, also into technological evolution, language evolution, cultural evolution. And I want to say, so that's very important. And you have, Dennett is a great place to go, because Dennett is a deep philosopher who is coming out of the late Wittgensteinian philosophy, but also he was an early adoption of computer usage and computational science, and he's interfacing with all these fantastic projects. So I would look at his work, and I mean, it's fantastic stuff like freedom evolves, for instance. You can understand how you can have determinism and freedom, and depending on each other, or Darwin's dangerous idea. There's some really deep but also accessible works I could highly recommend. Dennett, for instance, yeah.
Yeah, I would simply add, maybe there's something on morphogenesis that could come out of a combination of Darcy Thompson and Turing himself, which is be a really strange way of framing it, but nonetheless there is a kind of overlap in terms of that thinking. I've got a question from one of your PhD students from the EGS, from Daniela. Thank you, amazing synthesis. She's got two questions. Let's ask the first one. Please discuss the distinction between philosophy and theory. That's an interesting question. And explain your conviction that architecture is a theory-led discipline at a time when most architects resist and distance themselves from theory, and comprehensive systematic theories are scarce to non-existent. I want to just simply add to that. What I find really interesting is that Wolf Prix, who you included in that, and I think that Wolf is an amazing person, but he overtly rejects the fact that he's in any way interested in theory, but he has got one of the most profound understanding of Derrida that I've come across. And secondly, his work engagement with Wolf Singer is really interesting. But anyway, that's a good question from Daniela.
Yeah, very much so. I mean, this distinction isn't always maintained. That sometimes these are synonymous. Sometimes when it comes particularly to French theory and post-structuralism and so on. So, but where I would call Derrida's work philosophy, because there's not a particular object and agenda through which to succeed. It's critique. Now, theory for me, I mean, let's say, and then maybe theory which becomes closer to a science, but it couldn't be always equated with that if it's particular theory guiding a practice. Is the role is different. So and how you engage with an architect is different. So the philosophy is probing, critique, opening up, generating conceptual tools, but not yet the putting together of these insights and tools relative to concrete project domain, like architecture. It doesn't mean it's a very particular project. You can have also, so my works are works of architectural theory. They absorb a lot of philosophy and conceptual tools into it, and then I'm building up a theory. And you have to look at it simply like a science. So the philosopher, you can really creatively appropriate and draw out the conclusions. There is something where you can say it's not an anything goes. We can then discuss whether you got the essential opening which the philosopher gives you, and whether you actually get it, what roughly that space which is opening for you to fill. For instance, when you have free-floating signifiers, and how do you engage with this? So you can, in philosophy, it's not prescribed. It's difficult to say totally this is better or worse. You can throw something out as trivial and superficial, but there's a space of not yet not filled out and completed, So you can say I'm engaging with philosophy in terms of being set up, inspired, tooled up, and the theory which really delivers in the end instructions. It may be too hard to work, but you have to follow. You know, you have evidence and theoretical constructs in which you plug in empirical data, and then you get instructed with your practice and informed. So that's very difficult. It is much more the applied condition. It's the difference between, let's say, pure mathematics and applied mathematics. Pure mathematics, they take responsibility only for some kind of internal coherence of the algebra, but that's not yet a theory in which you have to take, build out and build in, let's say, mathematizing a problem domain with a specific set of success criteria. And I think theory should work towards that. And it's a very helpful. I mean, if you maintain that distinction, that would be helpful. But I think out there in the wild, it's not being maintained.
Can I just ask you? I know you've got to go, but one final question, and it's prompted in some way by a comment from one of our panelists, a guy called Harif Al-Saidi, who's actually in Iraq. And I guess when this is part of what we're trying to do, to reach out to everyone all over the world, and we've had some, I don't know, students in Uganda and Kenya and God knows where, everywhere. It's incredible. We've got one in Bangladesh and so on right now, but we have one in Iraq, and it prompts me to think, because we've also been discussing mathematics and things, and the one person that we haven't really mentioned enough is Zaha herself, who somehow, in terms of inclusive futures, is the icon, because she comes from Iraq, and in an incredibly male-dominated society, she broke through and really kind of was a kind of pioneer in many ways, and an inspiration for all female students out there right now, especially those who come from countries where their first language is not English and so on. But in some ways, I just wanted to think whether you could sort of kind of comment, because she was somebody, from my experience anyway, who never referred to philosophers as such and things. And yet, do you think that there was a kind of consistent theoretical or philosophical kernel in the way that she approached her design work?
Yes. So what I would say with respect to Zaha, that her original sensibility was the modernization story, that grand narrative, that technological progress, social progress, planning, and so on. So that, and I think that in the AA and with Rem, and then later on through the discourses which were flowing, she was also influenced to actually get empowered to be more explorative as well. I think so. That was interesting. But what I think was constructive, that even that the better world, the creation of a better world and a better place and society and well-being, a condition of well-being was always on the horizon, and the straight march became a kind of winded and complex path. But I think it was helpful and healthy and useful, and it's matched up with my sensibility, not to be kind of to see the post-structuralist critique as undoing any sense of destiny and goal orientation, which it seems to be doing. I'm not sure if it's doing it in the final analysis truly, but I think that was the healthy part. So there's this kind of modernization trajectory, but in getting there, she allowed all the insights of the, let's say, the post-structuralist, I call it the post-structuralist enlightenment now, to be absorbed and empower her and empower us, without having that situation where you in a sense you get entangled in some kind of sense of meaninglessness. And it is strange if you think about it. I sometimes think about, I mean, I don't know any details, and maybe I shouldn't say it, but if you have, Gödeboer and Deleuze and his figures committing suicide, I don't know. Zaha would never have contemplated that, nor would I ever.
Yeah, no, I guess it's a French intellectual thing, because Deleuze and whatever, there is a long history of that. And more recently, I'm blanking on his name, but one of our digital futures philosophers.
Unfortunately, I have to bring this to a close, and thank you for giving me this platform.
Well, Patrick,
Can we leave it
thanks
at
so
that?
much. I think there was a comment that's been made to say, let's get a panel together and discuss all this. I think,
That would be
this is just
great.
the beginning of something. Thank you so much. This is really a really important injection of a certain viewpoint. Fabulous. Thank you so much, Patrick.
Thank you,
So, and
guys.
thank you
Good to
also
see
to
you.
can I just simply thank those behind the scenes making this happen, an incredible team, generously giving their time to do this, and thank you for the questions and so on. I'm sure sorry we weren't able to deal with all of them. So thank you so much indeed. Thank you everyone, and thank you, Patrick. That was a great contribution. Thank you.
Thanks.